Well, thank you very much for joining us for the panel right now. My name is Mike Mazar. I'm with RAND, one of the content partners of the forum, and very delighted to be here with you with an expert panel that I'll introduce in a minute to talk about this very broad but very important subject. It's a particularly important subject, this rules for this kind of non-military competition, the competition going on below the threshold of armed conflict these days, because it really is in some ways, I think, addressing this issue is a precondition in a lot of ways for getting at a lot of the other issues that we are talking about. If we're interested in having better multilateral and multipolar governance, the barrier to that is not necessarily a lack of appreciation for the problems or an agreement that we need to do something about some of them. It's not necessarily a problem that we don't know how to build institutions or rules or norms. There is, of course, a degree of populism in a number of countries these days that is skeptical of multilateral cooperation, but one of the biggest barriers to doing what this forum is essentially calling for is the rising competition among major powers in the world today. And that competition is being played out in these areas that we're going to talk about, in the areas of non-military competition, areas below the threshold of armed conflict. And so in order to get to the goal of better multipolar governance, we have to address these sources of competition. In particular, this kind of competition is being expressed in several different ways that we're going to touch on in the panel today and provide for a very wide spectrum of possible discussion. It's emerging in the area of economics, it's emerging in the area of information in particular, with intervention into other societies by information means, competition for establishing the truth on certain issues. It's emerging in regional competitions and disputes over sovereignty and sovereign claims in different kinds of areas. All of these areas of competition are growing, and the risk is that they metastasize among the major powers and medium powers in the world, and they destroy the space for productive cooperation in areas of multipolar governance and in the kind of rule building that the Emir referred to in his thoughtful introductory remarks to the conference. So that's really what this session is about, with a focus in particular on solutions. And what we have asked the panelists to think about and talk about for a few minutes to start is there have been a variety of analyses of this growing problem over the last several years. But what do we do about it? What are some actual ideas for rules of engagement, as the topic of the session suggests, to constrain the rising competition in these non-military areas and leave as much space as possible for multipolar governance in a world that desperately needs it? And to address those questions, we have a highly expert panel. I will briefly refer to highlights of their bios. From NATO, we have Stephanie Babst, the head of the NATO Strategic Analysis Capability. She's been on the NATO international staff since 1998, and in her current role is responsible for providing strategic foresight to senior leaders at NATO. To my left is Tuosheng Zhang, is chairman of the Academic Committee and director of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the China Foundation for International Strategic Studies. He has had a number of military jobs and analytical jobs in his career and has been studying these issues for quite some time. To Stephanie's left, Andrei Kortunov is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. He has been Deputy Director of the Institute on USA and Canada Studies, and he is a historian and has taught at both US and Russian institutions. And finally, Patty McGinnis is currently founder of Hudhud Associates, but after a long career in the Foreign Commonwealth Office, capped his career there with about 4 years, I think, as Deputy National Security Advisor for Intelligence, Security, and Resilience in the UK Cabinet Office, dealing with exactly these kinds of issues. So, I'll turn first to my immediate left, to Tuosheng. This first question, this goal of practical action that we seek in this area of rising non-military competition among the major powers, including, of course, China and the United States and others. What, in a couple of minutes, is one example or a couple of brief examples of particular rules of engagement that you think would be important for these powers to consider to constrain this competition enough to leave us the opportunity to work together on multilateral governance?
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to focus on maritime security competition, especially in the South China Sea, East China Sea. And I think since 2008, especially since 2010, serious maritime frictions and competition happened in South China Sea and the East China Sea. So at that time, even before I think in 2014, some people said the situation in East Asia just like that before the World War I. Yeah. So they think there could be a military conflict. But however, now the situation has been changed a lot, and the situation has been relaxed, apparently in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. So what's the lessons? What are the experience? I think several points here. The first is all the countries, including China, believe the international law, the UN Charter, and the UNCLOS should be the basis for us to restrain, to manage the risks of the non-military conflict operation. But you see, the UNCLOS is a product of a compromise. So people have a different understanding of it, and there are still some ambiguity within it. So UNCLOS can't solve everything, but they are basis. So secondly, I think very important is to develop and strengthen the CBM, security CBM, and the code of conduct. So in recent years, in these two South China, in the East Asia, we have made a huge progress. For example, China and the US has sent two CBM memoranda. One is about the notification of major military activities. The other is the code of conduct in air and at sea. And between China and Japan, we have also signed agreement on liaison mechanism. So that's also very important. Also, the China and I think adopted queues with almost 30 navies at the West Pacific Symposium. And later, China and the ASEAN countries reached agreement to apply the queues in the South China Sea. So all these play very, very important. And the more important is that China and ASEAN is discussing more binding code of conduct in South China Sea. We have made a huge progress. So we expect the conduct, COC, could be reached, the agreement on this could be reached in 2 years. Finally, I want to say that is also the crisis management mechanism is also very important. Now, China has established a hotline with United States, Russia, ASEAN countries, South Korea, India. And also we established a hotline platform for the senior diplomats in response to the emergency with ASEAN countries.
Yeah.
So all these play a very important role.
Okay, that's fantastic. It's gotten off to a great start with some very specific notions, and what you're referring to is a process that creates as much of a rule-governed situation as possible, building on international law, moving into codes of conduct, and creates communication and confidence-building relationships and mechanisms that promote communication between sides. Those are some great examples. Stephanie, what would you add in terms of ideas for rules of engagement?
I would like to respond to your question twofold. Number one, I do represent an organization called NATO, which is comprised of 29, very soon 30 member countries. And we have collectively, some time ago already, started to make a collective effort for better understanding what we are talking about when we talk about hybrid threats. That's, I think, a very important first step. And number two, to craft a strategy that would help member countries to not only deter and defend against hybrid challenges and risk, but ultimately also come up with some practical ideas how to strengthen national resilience the national resilience of member countries to mitigate the effects of these multiple challenges. I think that's important to mention because before we get closer to looking at what we can possibly do in order to set up new norms and rules of engagement, we need to be very clear about the threat and the challenges at hand. NATO works very closely with member countries, as I already said, to help strengthen their national resilience. But we have also come to strengthen our partnerships with the European Union. And more recently, which I think is absolutely critical in terms of tackling hybrid threats more effectively in the future, we have started to also work more closely with the private sector. Yeah? And I mention this because I think if we are about to think how to set up new norms or regulations, for instance, for countering cyber threats or threats to challenges stemming from meddling in domestic affairs of other countries, we need to really think who are the stakeholders that we would need to bring together. And governments, state actors, for sure, I mean, they constitute a very important part of that community. But I would argue that the private sector in particular needs to be part of that discussion. That leads me to the second point I would like to make. If I look at the vast spectrum of hybrid threats that we are currently facing, it seems to me that one area in particular should be ripe for, let's say, at least starting to have a conversation about how we can set up norms and rules, and which is the cyber domain. We have, following a number of attacks in our member countries, on cyber attacks on member countries, one particular example at NATO, which is the country of Estonia, that suffered a couple of years ago quite a significant attack, a cyber attack. And the Estonians, they, I thought, reacted very cleverly in terms of setting up a manual. I mean, that starts, first of all, describing what constitutes a cyber threat and what could be areas of attribution, how to attribute a cyber threat. And then we would need to actually go along the whole list of questions. The cyber domain, I think, is a very good example demonstrating how difficult it is, I mean, to really get nations or state actors to agree on only the definition of the problem. So following the attacks on Estonia a couple of years ago, we have now a cyber, let's say, Geneva Convention in place, at least a manual in place, a starting point to which nations have already agreed. And looking again at what NATO's contribution could be, I think we can use that in order to widen the scope, both in terms of bringing in partner countries as well as other interested countries who would use that as a basis for a discussion. But what it really, really boils down to is obviously political will. Without the political will to sit down and have a meaningful discussion about norms and regulations, I mean, we will not go anywhere.
Yeah. So just a quick follow-up question, if I might. Is part of your argument that when we talk about rules of engagement for this competition, that actually demonstrating a capability for resilience and the capability to defend oneself is, in effect, a rule of engagement, even apart from talking about agreements or norms or limits?
We have more recently, I think it was at the London summit just a couple of, in fact, days ago, described that we don't look at NATO's domains just in terms of the classical land, air, and sea domains, but we have described cyber as a domain. We have described space as a domain. And this is, from a purely military, political, strategic point of view, this very, very starting point. You need to be clear, what is it that you talk about? Yeah. So if we identify one of these areas like cyber, then we can start going. And yes, getting getting, not getting, but rather supporting nations to strengthen their own resilience is an absolutely critical step in order to get going on this.
Okay, thank you. Andre, thoughts for particular rules of engagement?
Let me start with sharing my personal experience. It'll take 2 minutes, but I think it's worth it. Last year, we were working with our American counterparts on the agenda of the Helsinki meeting between Trump and Putin. And John Bolton came to Moscow, and I was invited by the US Ambassador, John Huntsman, to a private breakfast with John Bolton and with Fiona Hill. And we kept thinking about deliverables, what we could deliver in Helsinki. And one of the most apparent ideas was to agree on non-interference. Because on the one hand, Trump was concerned that during the forthcoming midterm elections, Russia would get into the US political life, and he wanted to come back to Washington saying that he convinced Vladimir Putin that he would not do that. On the other hand, of course, in Russia, in the Russian political leadership, there were also concerns about the United States interfering into Russian political life. And we started working on that. And we failed. Why did we fail? We failed because exactly the definitions of interference were so different. And the abilities of respective leaders to control interference were also different. For Putin, it was relatively easy to block Russian NGOs from working in the United States, or to block Russian media from participating in the political life in the United States. For Trump, to imagine that Trump would pick the line, call George Soros and tell him, look, George, from now on, please keep your hands off Russia. It would be difficult. Or, to order CNN not to be too tough on Putin would be difficult. So it's not because people are stupid, but because political systems are so asymmetrical. And when we're talking about rules of the game, about engagement, we should keep in mind that these rules should apply to very different political systems. They should apply to mature democracies, to hybrid systems, to autocracies, to traditional monarchies, whatever. And that makes it very difficult. In my opinion, we should address 3 issues, and I might repeat something which Stephanie has said, but I think it is really important. First of all, the issue of definition. I think it's critical because sometimes the issue of interference and non-military conflicts becomes almost theological. We put everything in the same basket, and then it's impossible to handle it. So if we cannot agree on everything, we should compartmentalize issues. And we should start with something which is more or less evident and where our interests coincide. For example, you take cyber. I think cybercrime is a perfect case where we could agree, and then we can gradually proceed to more complicated and more controversial issues. Second, Stephanie also mentioned that, but I would like to emphasize it once again. One of the key issues is attribution. And it becomes a difficult issue because there are so many non-state actors. There are so many irresponsible organizations that might cover behind states. And it might really lead us to endless discussions on attribution. I think that the issue of attribution, objective, credible attribution, can be resolved by strengthening international organizations and regimes. So we can get unbiased, objective judgment on attribution that cannot be questioned or challenged by countries involved. It's difficult. I understand that it's easy to say, very difficult to implement, but I think it's the only way. And finally, of course, we talk about definition, attribution, but we should also talk about prevention or deterrence. And my take is that we should really diversify our reactions, because if our reactions are limited, let's say, to sanctions only, well, usually sanctions do not work, at least in the short term. So we have to be creative in combining positive and negative incentives to those who might break the rules.
Fantastic thoughts there. And the point about asymmetric systems is really essential. If we're trying to build multipolar governance in a world where systems are asymmetric and don't even agree on definitions, that's very difficult. Just a very quick follow-up, and then I'll come to Patty. The idea of international organizations and regimes that help establish attribution is very attractive. Those who work these issues in the United States, for example, perhaps the UK, would likely be very skeptical that Russia would agree to any such institutions that are really legitimate and can actually establish objective attribution. Do you think that there's a possibility that the Russian government would see its own interests in that kind of a regime at some point?
Well, first of all, let me say that I don't believe that we'll be able to have legally binding agreements on major issues anytime soon. So it should be voluntary. It should be done in the format of regime. And I think for countries like Russia, but not only for Russia, for the United States as well, it will be very important to realize that there is such thing as credit history of a country, that international reputation does matter. Even if there is no legal commitment, even if we cannot codify certain things, it is something that has real costs. If we do that, we will convince our leaders to take it more seriously.
Superb. Okay, Patty, your thoughts.
Mike, thank you very much. So I'm a practitioner in the sense that I was responsible in the British government for building national resilience, but I was also responsible for building the capabilities in particular cyberspace, but more broadly for our intelligence and covert capability. So I'm a practitioner, and now I'm in business with Hudhud. I'm still a practitioner because this, when we think about information systems, is a battle played out in the corporate space and not so much on government networks when we're in non-military conflict. So I'm still a practitioner today, and I've got really two thoughts. The first one is, when we think about norms and when all this good work is done about what should apply, and I'm going to focus rather on data and network systems, so cyber more generally, although I'm a bit suspicious about isolating cyber as a domain. I see we need to talk about it that way, but the reality is it applies across all of the other domains, and therefore isolating is a bit strange. But when I think about the good work that's going on to develop norms, all of them are growing out of existing international law concepts. And actually, there are perfectly good international law concepts, for instance, for protecting medical facilities when one thinks about, a kinetic war. And so they wouldn't be the subject of an attack by a state, as the National Health Service was attacked when I was responsible for it. That wouldn't be acceptable for a state to attack it. An international law, and if you could demonstrate it, if you had attribution, you could go somewhere with it. But I want to suggest to you, when we think about norms, that there are categories of data and network systems that are different and require a new response. So let me just suggest two or three. And incidentally, we tend to spend our time talking about what I call the ephemeral internet. It's ephemeral because my 18-year-old daughter tells me she can't live without it, right? Seems to me what's really important is industrial control systems that actually enable us to live and function, and data sets that enable transformational technology. So, two examples. The first, seems to me that as we build up genomic databases, as Qatar is doing, as is going on in the United Kingdom, out of which individual treatments are derived for each of us, that the data integrity of that genomic database has a different value to the functioning of the air conditioning in a hospital if it's disrupted by a cyber attack, because it's fundamental to our collective well-being. It's in the same category as what we think about variant biological weapons. You're messing in the same space. So that deserves special protection. It also seems to me that international financial systems, which, if disrupted, could have catastrophic effect, I believe cause death, I think they have a particular value and protection. So it seems to me, first thought, therefore, that when we think about norms, we absolutely must draw on what's gone on in the past, but we must say there are special categories that we particularly protect, and I think we should start with those. And I think we should start at the cutting edge of technology, because technological change is so fast. People like those on the panel, including me, can't keep up. So there's a risk we'll make norms for the past, not the future. So my first thought. My second thought is building on something that Stephanie said about resilience. And there are two aspects to this. I think there is a norm around resilience. I think one already exists in that if you hold nuclear materials or if you hold biological materials of a certain kind, and if you have chemical weapons, under existing treaties, you're expected, you are responsible for their protection and their use. I'm not having a dig at my Russian friend from the United Kingdom, but still, you are responsible for their use, okay? Seems to me that if you hold genomic information, or you have large data centers on which other countries less technologically capable, especially in the global south, depend, you have a special responsibility. So this question of resilience is about, and I'll come on to this in a second, closing out the space for others to attack you, but it's also about meeting an international norm of what your responsibilities are for particular special data and systems. And then just to finish off the resilience point, in my experience, the thing that makes a hacker and a state most miserable is if you take away their capability. Yeah? And you can do that technologically, and you can do it through attribution. That is about the owners of network systems, and that's mainly businesses, being really, really good at knowing what goes on their systems and defending them. So this resilience question isn't just a matter of we'll be safer, but also we will close out the opportunity for an adversary to do us harm. Yeah? And we will close out the area we have to depend on norms. Depending on norms, as weaker states know, is not often a good way to go. It's much better to be capable in deterrence, but capable in defense. That's a much better basis to operate on.
Yeah, that's a great point, that the potential to build rules is greater when both sides feel like the capability they're giving up has already been constrained. And another point that actually your comments had in common with Tuosheng's is build on international law. Start with established international law principles and then begin to extend from there. Let me, Patty, ask you one quick follow-up. Before the session, we were talking about the public-private aspects of the information components. There are obviously, it seems like you can't go too far into talking about new rule sets in this realm without bumping into very fundamental issues of the status of data, the nature of information networks in our society. Do you think that, from your experience as a practitioner, is there a good deal of progress we can make absent those discussions, or are we going to have to, over the next few years, try to begin resolving some of these very fundamental questions about who holds data, what their responsibilities are, in order to set the groundwork for the kind of rules that we need?
So I think we're already doing that. You only have to look at something like the General Data Protection Regulations, which define a certain category of data and who's the data owner and who's the data processor, and there's a whole framework there. But I think where I take you is this. The mistake we make is to think about Mark Zuckerberg, right? Because what really matters to us sitting in this building today, is whether or not industrial control systems, many of them dependent upon positioning data and timing, right, function. And if we start with norms and arrangements around those and public-private partnership around those, we'll develop a set of rules that are then applicable to the more conflicted space, such as the media space, which my Russian friend here was referring to. So the mistake is to start with Zuckerberg. The thing to do is to start by saying, how do we get these vital systems and the vital data that's on them, how do we agree norms around that, where we're likely to have commonality? So crime is one area, but it does seem to me the question of timing is a really interesting one. So, and this shows you the complexity of cyber, in that you can't do cyber security anymore if you can't do space security. Because almost all the devices that we rely on, such as this one here, and I know few of you use one of these depend on a GPS or similar signal. Yeah? As does the oil and gas facilities that are run in Qatar, as does the water salination, it all does. So if you start saying, oh, well, we're going to have norms around cybersecurity, we're going to have norms around space, because if you start interfering with the satellite signals, interference with whether any of this kit works, including hospital equipment. So the complexity is there for you. I think we have to start that end and then work our way into the ones where, you know, the First Amendment or Mr. Putin's right not to be criticized is in question, because otherwise we get stuck in a loop, which is a little bit pointless.
So another great principle out of this discussion is start with the low-hanging fruit or the areas where you think you can actually get something done. Let me just come to Andre for a quick second. So we've just heard some thoughts about how to make progress in these areas from a practitioner from the United Kingdom who we could say is on the other side of an information competition from Russia, not that you represent the Russian government. As you listened to everything he said, was there anything you found to disagree with, or what was your reaction to the sort of ideas he was laying out?
Frankly, I don't have much to disagree with. I think that the points were well taken, including the interconnection between cyber and space. And I think that though we are talking about non-military conflicts, these conflicts might be connected to military, or at least kinetic conflicts, and that includes space and cyber and lethal autonomous systems. Unfortunately, we do not have a lot of regulations on that. And I think that, for example, on space, there were initiatives. I think we can bridge the gap between the Russian-Chinese proposal on the one hand and the position of Western countries on the other. So in my opinion, I would definitely agree to that. And let me also say that though it seems that there is an abyss between, let's say, Russia and the European Union on many of these issues, but when you get to the European Commission and to appropriate governmental agencies in Russia and talk to them about 5G, you will find a lot of common positions and a lot of intention to cooperate, because nobody wants to pilotless trucks to stop at the Estonian-Russian border. They are thinking about common standards. And I think this might be something which I would call an entry point, because what we need, especially for countries like Russia, maybe for China as well, to create a critical mass of stakeholders interested in universal regimes. So these stakeholders can exercise certain leverage on decision makers, which almost by definition are very cautious, not to use a better word, in going for any international limitations of their flexibility.
Yeah, that's one of the most important ideas that I've heard in the last couple of days, a critical mass of stakeholders interested in universal regimes that we can build across a multipolar context as the fuel, the engine of these kind of rules we're talking about. Stephanie, let me come back to you, and let me just say, I'm going to ask a couple more follow-up questions. I've been told we have to conclude exactly on time at 12:10, so I'm going to ask a couple more short questions and then open it up to questions from the audience, so be ready with your questions. But Stephanie, so you talked about the efforts within NATO to coordinate on these kinds of issues. Obviously, in the information realm, the way the United States and the European Union are approaching some of these issues is not identical. What would you tell us about how much unanimity you have seen within NATO and or the EU in approaching the kinds of issues we're talking about? Is there a great deal of agreement, or are there significant sort of differences of opinion on how to handle some of these fundamental information questions?
As I alluded to already earlier, I mean, we do have, typically for NATO, agreed on a strategy. So this is a consensual document describing the phenomenon we are talking about, and making a few proposals for how to actually respond to that. Mm-hmm. The information domain is one of it. Yeah? And what we have seen in the past couple of years is that nations have become more and more recognizant of this. I mean, they come to acknowledge the importance of that, which I think is really it's really critical, because if you could just have a couple of countries who feel this is really a hot burning issue and others don't, I mean, then you have a problem. So there is consensus, anonymous consensus.
Okay.
The second is we have started to collaborate very closely with the European Union institution on that. We have, for instance, set up strategic communication cells trying to identify where false apps and false news, misinformation campaigns and the like stem from. Again, here is the issue of attribution. Yeah. We have started to look jointly at technology, which are the best technologies in place that could actually help us identifying these type of threats. And then we have also set up what we call at NATO, in the NATO jargon, rapid response teams. Rapid response teams set up by NATO, consisting of a couple of experts and augmentees from member countries that could be sent to a given crisis, to a given country. We are in early stages of this. Yeah? This is not a fully elaborated scope of activities yet, but I think that there is, as I said already, there is growing recognition. For me, this is what actually is most important, and preparedness by the member countries, I mean, to invest resources, energy, and political will into that.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, one more question I'll ask to Tuosheng here. The other discussion has focused a lot on information aspects. Obviously, you talked about the maritime question. In either of those areas, there are some aspects of American policy that have come up in our discussions here. But from a Chinese perspective, if you were to say to the U.S. Or nominate to the United States a couple of rules of engagement that could constrain American policies that you see, that would be most important to avoiding non-military conflict, what are some of the areas that you would highlight if you could sort of pass a memo to the American Secretary of State or National Security Advisor and say, we want to work in this direction, but here are some things we'd like to see from the United States? What would you say?
I want to say is nowadays in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, the maritime competition has been relaxed between China and its neighbors. But the friction between China and the US continue to increase. So this is a serious challenge and serious risks. So my proposal is that I think that number one risk is now U.S. has normalized so-called free free navigation operation in the surrounding area of Chinese reefs and the Chinese islands. But I hope U.S. military should not send warships to the Xisha Island. Xisha Island, China has a basic line. And we have declared the territorial water. But the U.S. always sent warships into the 12 miles of a Xisha Island. So it's very dangerous. It could cause serious crisis and maybe the military conflict. So this is the first. Secondly, I think nowadays U.S. just not itself also invite UK, France, ask South Korea, Japan to join large-scale military exercises in South China Sea. I don't think it's a good way. Yeah. So there would also will be a lot of risks. So this is, I hope you can have some military exercises, but not hold those kind of large-scale joint military exercises in the South China Sea. And finally, I hope China and the US can have a serious strategic dialogue about the South China Sea, about militarization in this region. It's very important. US blame China has done a lot of things that's militarized the South China Sea. But China think US has done a lot of things to militarize the South China Sea. So we should have a serious talks. Now China has proposed a dual-track approach. That is, we should solve the territorial disputes with neighbors by bilateral talks. We should talk with ASEAN to establish a code of conduct to stabilize the situation. I propose another one is China, USA, and Japan, South Korea, and all the countries join hands to keep the freedom and the security of the sea lane of communication in the South China Sea. This is what we can do, and we can reach it. We should, and we can reach agreement. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few questions, and what I'll do is take them one at a time and direct them to an individual member of the panel. If you could state your name when you ask your question. Sir, you've had your hand up for a little while. That doesn't seem on.
Hello, my name is John Gearson. I'm from the Centre for Defence Studies at King's College in London. If I may say, obviously the panel struggles to deal with the fact that states are competing in this space and see advantage in exploiting these areas. And so we talk about rules of the game, but this is about states trying to exploit those rules or the absence of rules. And it seems to me what we haven't talked about is how some of those tools are disorder, not order. It's the exact opposite of the things that are being suggested. And states and others see this as something that can be used. And the use of proxies. And so my question to the panel is, and may I just add, I don't see going down the criminal route as that useful because criminals want order, they don't want disorder. We have to deal with the disorder. I'd just like to ask the panel, for non-state sponsored, non-state actors, so not proxies, will it take an extreme act by that sort of group to get international agreement?
It's not on either. Is that on? Is that? Okay, there we go. So as I said, I think we'll have one panel member address each question, and that way we can get to a few questions. So Patty, do you want to take that one on?
The Brit talking to the Brit.
Exactly. It seemed to make sense.
Well, John, I mean, we know each other, but I don't accept your framing around criminality. Frankly, I think concepts of criminality remain critical. I'm going to drive them through, and they are a basis for cooperation. It is noticeable, whilst there is undoubtedly interference and a presence which is unhelpful, which appears to originate from Russia in a variety of systems that the United Kingdom might be concerned about, whether they be physical systems like telephone switching or the discourse around our elections. There is also a cooperation with Russia around criminal groups and criminal groups active online. You know, there's a strong cooperation in other areas where you'd want it with Russia, if you think about, you know, the cooperation around nuclear materials, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all sorts of areas where there is cooperation. We need to build from it, and starting from a different place doesn't work. It does seem to me that I'm afraid effective norms usually follow disaster. Yep, and I'm afraid I think in cyberspace we're probably going that way. I think effective behavior by companies also follows disaster. It's very noticeable that the number of companies who are taking risks, you only have to look at the length of time it takes to discover an intrusion on a company network. I think Verizon thought in the US it was 78, 79 days, which is mad, when it should be moments, can be moments. So I think what I'm saying to you is I think the way to bring order or to deal with the disorder question, one, is to, in network systems, is one, for people to understand the duty that we all have to know what's happening on our networks and to respond to it, because that closes out the space for people who are creating disorder. That applies, and that also applies to that nice Mr. Zuckerberg. If he's going to encrypt everything, he's going to be responsible for everything that happens behind that encryption. He thinks he's not, but he is. Yeah? So that's one thing. And the other one is, I do think we have to work on the basis of the criminal law and work our way into, with non-state actors, and work our way into kind of blocking out the space they operate in. And I'm afraid catastrophic events are likely to drive that.
Okay, we have one over here. Sir, if you can. identify yourself and ask a quick question.
Pierre Lelouch, I'm a former member of parliament and a former minister in France. Just a quick remark and then a question. Remark is that a lot of the tension in this area is not only with China or with Russia, it's also with the allies, madam. On the cloud situation, we are literally, we, the French and other Europeans, literally pumped, our companies, our industry literally pumped by the Americans legally according to American law. So maybe you should look at that too inside NATO, because this is quite an inflammatory subject. On the question, I have listened very attentively what you said about cyber and space, but above and beyond governments, and assuming Americans, Europe agree with the Russian, the Chinese on rules of rule of the game, how can you do this if you don't control what the GAFA, the big companies, are doing? Because at the moment, nobody, and they have not been mentioned, interestingly enough, this morning, these guys are running the world. They're not being taxed. We can't even tax them. We don't know what they're doing. And if we don't break them out and we don't control them, it's very unlikely that we can actually fix some of the major challenges that we have in front of us. So we have a problem of governance here. We have huge companies whose revenues exceed the GNP of many countries.
And so is your question basically, can we solve this problem without addressing that?
Exactly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Stephanie, you want to take a shot at that and give us a sense of, are we making progress anyway within the West?
Yeah, and I'm extremely glad, Pierre, you mentioned that, because that was the point I made in my very earlier intervention. We need to work with the private sector on some of these roles. Yet, we are at the very, very beginning of this. And I am a big advocate of breaking the silos here, because, I mean, we keep on having these conversations in bubbles, yeah? I mean, we sit here in our bubble and talk about these issues. And the Facebooks and the Alibabas and who know, I mean, they're sitting in their bubble. And so we would need to bring these bubbles together. And without being too ambitious, I think we need to start small and really start to having basic conversations about responsibilities. Some of these responsibilities can be clearly spelled out more easily than others, but I think we need to have that conversation. And NATO has started a few of these initiatives, but for my taste, for my personal taste, there is still room for improvement.
Well, thank you so much. Well, I hate to do this, but it was really emphasized to me that we absolutely had to finish at 12:10. So I think I'll have to leave the questions there. I would say, obviously, our expert panelists will be outside. You can find them and ask your questions independently. One great lesson of this wonderful discussion with many, many great ideas is that there is room to work. There is room to work in the direction of sustaining and building on the rule-based order that the Emir talked about. There's room to work in the direction of multipolar governance. There are places to start, and there are avenues to move down if we have the political will. And that's at least a hopeful message in this time when there are not enough of them. So please join me in thanking a wonderful panel for some really great remarks.